This video is the third video describing Theta Grid Adjustment rules. In the previous video, we looked at Theta Grid Adjustment rules for verbs that take nominal arguments. In this video, we're going to talk about Theta Grid Adjustment rules for verbs that take clausal arguments. For example, force. This sentence is saying, "Today you're forcing me to stop working in the fields." This is Cain talking to God. "You're forcing me to stop working in the fields." So we have here the verb force, and we have here the patient clause or object complement clause. Before we look at these rules, I'd like to talk a little bit about complement clauses. The functional typological grammarians have studied more than 1,000 languages, and they've noticed that for complement clause, there's what they call the binding continuum. And this happens to be my favorite topic in all of linguistics, because this is universal. It's very rare that linguists can say a particular principle is universal. But for the binding continuum, this is applicable in every language. And I have some examples here in English. For example, Mary thinks that John might have read that book. So the matrix verb is think. Here's the complement clause marked with red brackets. We have a complementizer, the word that, which I've underlined. And the verb in this complement clause is fully inflected. We can say Mary thinks that John might have stopped reading that book, might not read that book. We can inflect this verb any way that we want. In other words, it's very finite. For the next example, Mary told John to read that book. Okay, linguists have found that as the matrix verb becomes more assertive, more influential, more forceful, the more forceful the matrix verb, then the more the complement clause is bound to the matrix clause. Mary told John to read that book. So now she's not just thinking it, now she actually told him to read it. So she's being a little bit more assertive. And we see that the verb in this clause has to be a to infinitive. Mary told John to read that book. We can't inflect this. Mary told John he might have read that book. We can't say that. It has to be to read that book. And there's no complementizer. There's no word that. In addition to that, the subject of the complement clause has been raised out of the complement clause and is now functioning as the object of the matrix verb tell. And we know that if we use a pronoun. Mary told him to read that book. We don't say Mary told he to read that book. It's Mary told him to read that book. So John has been raised out of the complement clause and is now functioning as the object of the matrix verb tell. And with force, we see the same thing. Mary forced John to read that book. So now she's being more forceful. And again, we see a to infinitive, and there's no complementizer, and the subject is raised out. Mary forced him to read that book. And in English, the most assertive verb of all is the verb to make. We say Mary made him read that book. Now it's not even a to infinitive. Now it's a bare stem infinitive. So as the matrix verb becomes more influential, more assertive, the more highly bound the complement clauses are to the matrix clause. So the matrix verbs impose a particular structure on their complement clauses. So when we're dealing with complement clauses, there are 3 points that we need to consider. Number 1, is there a complementizer? Number 2, how is the subject noun phrase in the complement clause realized? Is it raised so that it's functioning as the object of the matrix verb, or is it realized with big pro, or is it a full noun phrase? Number 3, is the verb in the complement clause finite or non-finite? So these are the 3 issues we need to deal with, and we've made it in TBTA so that it's very simple for you to specify these 3 points. So now let's go back to this verse, and we'll look at the Theta Grid Adjustment rule for the verb force. Now again, TBTA built the input structure for you when you created your language project. So again, TBTA knows that there's an obligatory agent noun phrase and there's an obligatory complement clause. And for all the verbs that take complement clauses as one of the arguments, we include the agent noun phrase and the verb phrase and its verb in the complement clause. So you can mark these easily. And first we're going to use the simple output option again. So we click this, and first it shows us how to deal with the noun phrases that are outside the complement clause, which in this case there's only one, it's the agent. And we don't need to specify the grammatical relation. We don't need to insert an add position, so we'll just say OK. So now we're dealing with the complement clause. Is there a complementizer? If yes, we can click here and type the complementizer. This verb doesn't take a complementizer, so I'm going to say cancel. We'll leave that blank. Is the subject raised? For the verb force, the subject of the complement clause is raised out. Mary forced him to read a book, so we're going to say subject raised. And as soon as we do that, the subject nouns, surface realization, this is for the subject noun of the complement clause. It's set to big pro. There will be a copy made, but this noun phrase will still be here, and this noun will be realized as big pro. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, verbs, target, tense, and form. Here we specify is it finite or non-finite. If we click here now, there's only one value, so we need to supply our values. So we'll click here on feature set. We'll go here to verbs. We'll go here to target, tense, and form, and we could add any values we need for our language. We'll say to, infinitive. We'll say air stem, infinitive, etc. Again, you can define any values that are pertinent to your language. So now when we come here, we can say to infinitive. And we're done with that. So now there's a copy of this noun phrase, and it comes out, and it's marked as patient and object for us. And we have a copy of the noun. This noun is set to a surface realization of big pro, and this verb, the target tense and form, is set to infinitive. So let's activate this rule. We'll turn it on, say OK. We'll generate this verse. This is a new language project. I have very few grammar rules in here, but it's saying, you forced me today to work in the fields. So you can see we still have a lot of work to do, but you can see that this noun phrase is out here. It's an object. If we rest our cursor here, we can see that it was inserted by Theta Grid Adjustment rule. Theta Grid Adjustments for expect A through have E. Theta Grid Adjustment for force A, structure 1. So it was inserted by that, and then when we come here, we see that the surface realization is set to big pro, and if we rest our cursor here, we again see that it was done by that Theta Grid Adjustment rule, and then here, target tense and form equals to infinitive. So now your subsequent grammar rules can look at that feature value, to infinitive, and provide, for example, the preposition to. We still have a lot more work to make this a valid sentence, but that's the idea. And I'd like to go back. Let's write this rule again, but this time we'll do it ourselves, step by step. If we go back to the input structure, it warns us we'll lose all the editing, all the modifications we've made in the output structure. We'll say yes. And now go to output structure. So now we get a fresh copy. And now let's build this rule ourselves, step by step. So we can click on features, and we'll set this to big pro. We'll click on this. We'll set this to infinitive. To copy this out, we want to copy it. We don't want to move it. So we'll say copy, and we click on the noun phrase, and then we click on where we want it to be copied. So now it'll copy that. And now we need to specify the features for this noun phrase. This will be a patient, and it will be an object. And this noun, we don't want this to be a pro, we want this to be a noun. And that's all we need to do. We'll click OK. We'll generate the verse. And again we see, you forced me. So again, this was copied out. We see inserted by Theta Grid Adjustment rule, Theta Grid Adjustment for force A, structure 1, etc. If we look here, the surface realization is set to big pro, so there is no target content, it's just null. And if we look here, the target tense and form is set to infinitive. So that's the idea. These matrix verbs impose a structure on their complement clauses. And you can specify those structures in your theta grid adjustment rule for the matrix clause.